But joining me now, delighted to have the company of the local historian and author Colm Liddy, who's with us for our latest instalment of Clare History in Focus. Good morning to you, Colm.
Good morning, Alan.
Thanks very much for popping into studio. And we are in the 19th century, and this week's chat focuses on the decade before we get to the famine. So the 1830s and begging to live in 1830s Clare. So I guess by that title alone, it wasn't exactly a food-filled existence for people in Ireland prior to the famine.
That's right. I suppose the fundamental fact is that if you start the clock in 1741, when there had been a previous famine, that over the next century, the Irish population went from 2.5 million to 8.5 million. Exponential growth such as you would rarely see. And at the same time, our ability to feed people was actually going into reverse. Industrialisation in Ireland went backwards for most of that period. So you just had people working away on the same finite amount of agricultural ground, and you've got, of course, no form of social welfare whatsoever, such that a lot of people, just to stay alive, have to beg for food every day.
God, all those elements you just mentioned, it really is a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
It is. And like, as bad as it was nationally, Clare was way worse. The rate of increase in Clare was double that of the national average. If you look at the censuses of like 1821 is the first one, and then there's one in 1841. Over that just 20-year period, the population of Kilmehel increased by 77%. Coolmeen, 82%. Go up to Fanor, same number, 82%. Around Blackhead, not exactly the world's most agriculturally viable place, 90% increase in population. Again, now this is in a 20-year period.
90%.
And then finally, taking the prize is Newquay, who in that 20-year period increased population by 368%.
Very good. New keys. What can we put our finger on as to why, and as you say, like Blackhead, not exactly a very agriculturally great spot. Was it just people were having bigger families, people were moving to these areas because there wasn't opportunity for them elsewhere? What was leading to these huge increases in population?
Yeah, I suppose the death rate from, kind of epidemics such as smallpox had decreased around that era. So more people were living. But, it's quite frightening, we'll say, just how many children, each family were having. And the potato was somewhat, keeping it all afloat. But like you had poverty from day one at your birth. Most Clare people during this era lived in wretched mud huts. What I mean now is like that it's literally an igloo made out of mud. That's what you're living in. There's only one room. In Clare, there was 38,000 of that type of house, which represented 85% of all houses in Clare. Like even you see old stone cottages now, the ruins of them. Those were the lap of luxury, because what you can no longer see is the mud huts, because they, of course, melted into the ground eventually. But most people were in those, and you were a baby born in that sort of environment, in a tiny little damp mud hut, really only fit for pigs. And the stillbirths at that time was 20%, and over the next few years, up to the age 5, 40% of children died.
I'm not surprised.
But if you got to 5, you probably would live a long enough life in poverty.
Because, I mean, in that environment, you're more likely to pick up all sorts of conditions, ailments, diseases. And of course, I mean, if these families, they're so poor, these are their homes, they don't exactly have the money to be bringing children to doctors or any of that kind of thing.
No, absolutely not. I mean, the ordinary hard-working people of that time, the labourer class who had no land and just had to work for a farmer, they, at best, were getting 8 pence a day. 8 pence a day was the standard wage. And worse than that, they wouldn't even be employed for the whole year. Farming is a extremely seasonal and cyclical occupation, so they would be quite idle. You'd be doing well if you were employed for 7 months of the year, and the rest of the time you just had to absolutely not spend any money because that was the state of employment.
But that is a difficult scenario. Nearly half the year to try and not spend money. I mean, I suppose just spend the other half conserving as much of it as possible. But of course, you have to live in that part of the year as well. And I guess that left people with very few options, because given the title is begging to live in 1830's Clare, Colm, that was really their only recourse of action, begging.
Indeed. So let us walk. At the time, they distinguished between very, elaborately all the different types of beggars that there were. So you first of all have the deserving type of beggar. So what happens if one of these labouring men gets ill and cannot do his work, for any serious length of time through injury or whatever? He's obviously, there is no social welfare, and his wife has to keep the show on the road. But the maximum amount of wages a woman can earn is 3 pence a day.
Ooh.
So there's your gender pay gap. Exactly. 8 pence and 3 pence. So it simply isn't possible for a woman to independently run a household. So what she has to do instead is gather up the children and each morning walk around a little bit of the parish begging. And what you do is you walk up to the households around and just stand outside the gate looking mournful, really, until they come out and give you a few potatoes. It's all, of course, in kind. There's rarely is it money. It's potatoes. And bizarrely as well, quite a lot of old people also had to do that. They were so poor that you would often have a scenario where the old man, who has given his house to the son can afford just about to let him stay, but cannot afford to feed him. So you have old people just going for a stroll every morning to get their few potatoes for the day.
I mean, look, obviously we're in a tricky situation at the moment, cost of living and fuel crisis and everything else, and there are people who are finding it hard. But when you hear about the Ireland of 2 centuries ago, poles apart.
Next we have the able-bodied beggars. So these are, you essentially have in every parish in Clare, because they kind of a commission arrived in town in 1834 and kind of took questions from each parish in Clare, and there was 50, generally speaking, about 50 beggars per parish who were just full-time beggars, and they would bring around a little sack, get the potatoes they needed, and generally speaking actually wind up with more than they needed, which they would then sell to other people. It's kind of crazy.
Talk about paying it forward.
But these beggars actually, if you like, the more professional style beggar was often welcomed into people's homes. He was a bringer of news. They were generally more charismatic sort of fellas who wandered around, and incredibly they would often get a bed for the night with the family. As you know, all of the people in those days slept in one bed in the corner of their little hut. And generally speaking, eldest daughter is near the wall, then the next daughter, down to the baby, then the wife, then the husband, then the youngest son, up to the eldest son. And then
there's people at home listening and they're like, how big is that bed?
He's on the outside. This is just, how it's done.
Right.
So also we have travelling beggars. So in County Clare, by this period, you have quite a bit of the gentry going to tourist spots such as Kilkee, Spanish Point and Lahinch. They were really becoming great places to go, and obviously it's a good place for beggars to go. So people would pass through Clare from all over the country to go there. Some of them were known to fake injuries. They were known as bakak, and they would pretend to be lame, to try and you'd find them also at markets and fairs. Another person who needed help, not just in money, was the widow, because she would often find herself with a small patch of land and not be capable of, tilling it so you would, in fairness, you would find people were so generous. A bunch of young men in the area would go to her farm, for instance, and pick all the potatoes or do all the weeding, do all the ploughing from time to time. Now that was the case for widows. There was sympathy for widows. Superficially similar, but not similar, was the case of any woman who dared to have a child out of wedlock. She was generally shunned by the community, getting no charity. In fact, not alone that, she was more likely to be evicted from the small hovel that she had, because she might be a danger to the morals of the community. Generally, the family would try their very best to make the man in question marry her, either through money or violence.
I know which I prefer.
And if that didn't work, she was kind of stuck because, as I say, within the community, she could have no peace. So typically, unfortunately, what happened is women like that would just have to go to a parish far away where they weren't known and they could pretend to be a widow, because a widow is acceptable. An unmarried mother is not acceptable. So sadly, that's what often happened.
Okay, what else do you want to let the listeners know about this situation?
It was an unsustainable situation, because the tragic thing, as well as so many people, like literally a few thousand people in Clare at least, who every day have to beg. And furthermore, they get their stuff not from rich people, not whatsoever. It's from fellow poor people, people who barely have more than themselves. That's who has to, pony up. The actual gentry, and indeed any kind of strong farmer, he would generally have his gate closed and nobody got to come up the avenue to him. So it was really just the poor feeding the other poor, a completely unsustainable situation.
My God, it's there's an element of that, I suppose, even in the modern world, that hasn't changed. The rich stay rich, and you're likely to get help from the poor as well. Thanks for bringing that to us, Colm. I presume, given we're talking about begging in 1830s Clare, we're edging ever closer to the key event of the last number of centuries in Ireland.
We are. We're getting there. But you can see that from this context, there's an inevitability to what will be coming next, because there's so many people so vulnerable. Ordinary life involves quite a bit of starving, never mind then when an actual disaster occurs. So, yeah, that's coming down the track in a few episodes.
Right, we look forward to that. Thanks for joining us as ever. If people want to check out more of what you do and what you're about, you do have an online shop?
I do indeed. It's called shopinireland.ie. Just Colm Liddy on that.
There's all sorts of snazzy t-shirts there. I have one with a number of cows on it in front of runes, which is I'm very happy with. So Colm, thank you very much.